So imagine you're standing at the base of this massive roaring river,
Okay.
and the water level is just rising every single second. It's churning with all this debris, and it looks like it's threatening to burst its banks at any moment. And your job, your sole responsibility here is to hold back that terrifying flood using a dam made entirely of paper.
Wow. I mean, that is a very visceral image, and frankly, a completely doomed engineering project.
It is, yeah. But it's actually the perfect metaphor for the political landscape of 19th century Europe. So welcome back to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today we are tackling AP European History topic 6.6, which is reactions and revolutions. We're going to be looking at that really volatile century that's just kind of sandwiched right between the fall of Napoleon in 1815 and the absolute catastrophe of World War I in 1914.
Right, and it's a period defined by this single, really high-stakes tension. It's the desperate struggle between an imposed order orchestrated by these deeply traumatized monarchs and the relentless, chaotic forces of change.
Yeah, we've got a great stack of sources today. We're pulling from historical analyses, diplomatic records, even some personal diaries from the era. And our mission for this deep dive is to uncover how the leaders of Europe basically tried to freeze time.
Which is impossible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Why they thought they could succeed at that, and why the whole project eventually just exploded right in their faces.
Because to understand the why, you really have to understand the trauma of 1815. You know, Europe had just spent 25 years dealing with the French Revolution and Napoleon.
Right. It was nonstop.
Nonstop. And to the kings and the aristocrats of the time, change didn't mean progress. It meant the guillotine. It meant constant warfare and total social collapse.
So the vibe isn't just, let's go back to the good old days. It's more like we have to lock this down right now before society disintegrates again.
Precisely. They were operating purely out of fear. And this is where we get the Congress of Vienna and the Concert of Europe.
Which was basically their big security system.
Right. And the architect of this system was the Austrian foreign minister Clemens von Metternich.
Metternich is such a fascinating figure to me. I feel like it's so easy to paint him as just the ultimate villain of the story, right? The guy who is shutting down free speech and crushing everyone's dreams.
Yeah, he gets that reputation.
But the sources suggest he really saw himself as a realist. He believed a multi-ethnic empire like Austria simply couldn't survive the rise of nationalism.
That is the key insight right there. He wasn't just being stubborn. He was actually being incredibly prescient. He knew that if you let every single ethnic group have its own state, the entire map of Europe would just dissolve into chaos.
Because the borders didn't match the ethnic lines at all.
Not even close.
Ah.
So he built a system based on two main pillars: legitimacy and the balance of power.
Legitimacy basically being a polite code word for only traditional monarchs get to rule.
Correct. No self-made emperors from Corsica allowed. And to enforce this, they developed the principle of intervention. You can almost think of it as a neighborhood watch for dictators.
A neighborhood watch, I like that.
If a revolution starts in Naples, the Austrian army marches in to crush it. If trouble brews in Spain, the French army goes down and handles it.
So it's this collective security pact. But instead of protecting borders, they're strictly protecting the social hierarchy.
Exactly.
They're using censorship. They have secret police spies everywhere just trying to keep a lid on things. But the problem is, you can't fight ideas with bayonets forever.
No, you really can't. And the pressure that was building behind that paper dam was coming from two very distinct ideologies: liberalism and nationalism.
Okay, we definitely need to pause on liberalism here. Because if you're listening to this today and you hear the word liberalism, you probably think of modern left-wing politics. But 19th century liberalism was something very, very different.
Very different. This was essentially the ideology of the rising middle class, the bourgeoisie.
The business owners, the lawyers.
Right. They wanted written constitutions, they wanted religious toleration and legal equality. But, and this is a huge but, they generally did not want democracy.
Which sounds so contradictory to us now.
It does, but they feared the mob. They looked at the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror and said, no, thank you. So they wanted voting rights, but restricted only to men who owned property.
So they basically wanted to break the aristocracy's monopoly on power, but they absolutely did not want to hand that power down to the guys working in their factories.
Exactly. It was about sharing power at the top, not giving it to the bottom. And then you have nationalism, which frankly was even more dangerous to the old order.
Because nationalism was this radical idea that political boundaries should actually match ethnic boundaries.
Right. If you speak German, you should live in a single German state. If you're Italian, you shouldn't be ruled by an Austrian emperor who lives in Vienna.
Which is a direct existential threat to an empire like Austria. I mean, Austria was just this massive patchwork quilt of Hungarians, Czechs, Croats, Italians.
It was the kryptonite to the Metternich system, and you can see the strain almost immediately. By the 1820s, the dam is already springing leaks. We call these the early rumbles.
Right, the early rumbles. And the first major crack is actually the Greek War of Independence in 1821. And this one is weird because it completely breaks the rules of the system they just set up.
It really does.
The Greeks rebel against the Ottoman Empire. By the logic of the concert of Europe, all the great powers should have rushed in to help the Ottomans crush the rebellion to maintain the conservative order.
Because the Ottoman Sultan was a legitimate monarch in their eyes. Theory says, yes, you crush it, but reality said no. The great powers, specifically Britain, France, and Russia, actually intervened for the Greek revolutionaries.
So why the hypocrisy? Was it just that they really liked Greek architecture and history?
I mean, there was actually a massive cultural component to it. The Romantic movement was in full swing. People like Lord Byron literally went to Greece to fight, and he died there. The European public really saw the Greeks as the descendants of Plato and Pericles fighting these barbaric occupiers.
The classical heritage.
Right, but the real driver, as always, was cold, hard geopolitics.
Let me guess. Russia wanted access to the Mediterranean.
Bingo. Russia wanted a warm water port. And Britain and France absolutely did not want Russia to have that influence all to themselves, so they all just jumped in to carve up the influence.
Which proves that if national interest is strong enough, conservative solidarity just goes right out the window.
It evaporated. But the Greeks were really the lucky exception. If we look at Russia just a few years later in 1825, we see a very, very different outcome with the Decembrist revolt.
Oh, the Decembrists. This whole event is just a tragedy of confusion and idealism, really.
It is. You have these Russian army officers who had literally chased Napoleon all the way back to Paris a decade earlier.
And while they were in the West, they saw Western society. They saw constitutions and civil rights. And they come back to feudal serf-owning Russia thinking, we could do better than this.
Right. So when Tsar Alexander I dies unexpectedly, there's confusion over the succession. And these officers stage a protest in St. Petersburg. But it was incredibly disorganized.
Oh, there's that famous anecdote, right? Some of the rank-and-file soldiers who were brought out to protest were chanting for Constantine and Constitution.
Yes.
Constantine being the guy they thought should be Tsar. But they were chanting for Constitution because they thought Constitution was the name of Constantine's wife.
It's almost darkly comic. But it really highlights the massive disconnect between the educated elite officers and the common soldiers they were commanding.
So what happens?
The new Tsar Nicholas I does not hesitate. He orders the artillery to open fire on the square. He crushes the revolt instantly.
And the aftermath wasn't reform, it was a deep freeze. Nicholas I basically becomes the gendarme of Europe, the policeman.
Exactly. He sets up the third section, which is his secret police, and he enforces this strict new doctrine of autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationality.
So while Western Europe is at least slowly experimenting with reform, Russia chooses total, uncompromising repression. They essentially bolt the safety valve completely shut.
A perfect way to put it. Now, speaking of Western Europe, let's look at France again. Because if 1815 was about putting the old Bourbon kings back on the throne, 1830 was about realizing they hadn't learned a single thing from the revolution.
Right, King Charles X. He is a classic case of self-sabotage. He actually tried to turn the clock all the way back to before 1789.
Which is just delusional.
He starts censoring the press, he strips voting rights away, he dissolves legislature. And the people of Paris respond with the 3 glorious days. They build barricades in the streets, they fight the army, and they force Charles X to abdicate.
But here's the twist. And this goes right back to our definition of 19th century liberalism. The people who actually fought and died on those barricades were mostly workers and students.
The lower classes.
Right. But the people who stepped in and decided the political outcome were the wealthy liberals. And they didn't declare a republic. They just brought in a more liberal cousin of the king, Louis Philippe.
The bourgeois king. The guy who literally walked around Paris with an umbrella instead of a scepter.
Yes, trying to look like a normal businessman. It was a massive victory for the upper middle class. But the workers who actually did the bleeding got almost nothing out of it.
And that betrayal is such a crucial foreshadowing for 1848. It shows that the alliance between the middle class and the working class is incredibly fragile. They have a common enemy, but entirely different goals.
And there was also the Polish Rebellion happening around the same time in 1830, where Polish nationalists tried to break free from Russia.
Which didn't go well.
No, Nicholas, I crushed that too. It just reinforced the power of these large land-based empires to crush internal dissent. But that brings us to the main event, the explosion, the revolutions of 1848.
Historians call it the springtime of nations. But looking at the sources, it ended up being a very harsh winter.
It really did.
It's hard to overstate the scale of this to someone today. It wasn't just one country having a crisis. It was France, Prussia, Austria, the Italian states, so the whole continent detonating simultaneously. Why did it all hit at once?
A huge part of it was economic. It was the Hungry 40s. You had a terrible economic depression combined with severe agricultural failure.
The potato blight.
Exactly. We usually associate that just with Ireland, but it hit the continent hard too. There were massive bread shortages, unemployment was skyrocketing, people were literally starving, and when you mix starvation with decades of political frustration, you get an explosion.
So let's break this down by region, starting with France again. Louis-Philippe, the Umbrella King, gets overthrown. A new republic is declared. But just like in 1830, those fault lines between the classes are visible almost immediately.
Right. You have the moderate liberals led by people like the poet Lamartine, and they just want political freedom and a constitution. But then you have the socialists led by Louis Blanc.
And they want economic survival.
Yes. They demand these national workshops to basically guarantee government-funded jobs for the unemployed.
And the government does set them up right. But they are incredibly expensive and controversial.
Very controversial. The middle-class taxpayers in the countryside hated paying for radical workers in Paris. So when the moderate government finally decides to close the workshops, the working class of Paris explodes again.
And this leads to the June Days, which, reading the accounts, is just terrifying. It wasn't a revolution against the king anymore. It was a straight-up class war.
It was. The army, heavily supported by the middle class, ruthlessly crushed the workers. Thousands were killed. Thousands more were exiled to penal colonies.
So the middle class basically looked at the socialists and decided they were way more afraid of the poor demanding wealth redistribution than they were of an authoritarian dictator.
That is the exact calculus they made. And that fear drove them straight into the arms of Louis Napoleon, who was Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew.
He comes in promising order and glory.
He plays on the nostalgia of his uncle's name. He gets elected president of the republic, and then, surprise, surprise, within a few years, he overthrows his own government and declares himself Emperor Napoleon III.
So the revolution literally ate itself and just produced another strongman.
Exactly. Now, meanwhile, over in the German states, we see a very different kind of tragedy playing out with the Frankfurt Assembly.
This was supposed to be the great liberal triumph, right? It's a room full of professors, lawyers, and intellectuals from across the German states trying to write a constitution for a newly unified Germany.
It was very high-minded, very idealistic. They sat there debating fundamental rights and drafting borders for months.
But while they were debating and writing essays, the old conservative kings of Prussia and Austria were quietly regrouping their armies.
They were buying time. And when the assembly finally finishes this beautiful constitution and they offer the crown of a unified Germany to King Frederick William IV of Prussia, he delivers one of the most devastating insults in diplomatic history.
He refused to, quote, pick up a crown from the gutter.
Yeah.
I mean, that is just staggering arrogance. But it perfectly reveals the fundamental worldview of the conservatives, doesn't it?
Completely. To a king like him, a crown isn't valid if it's offered by elected representatives. It has to come from God or from the consensus of other kings. You don't take a crown from the people.
From the gutter.
Wow.
So, without Prussia's military power backing them up, the Frankfurt Assembly was basically just a really intense debating club.
That's all it was. The movement just collapsed. The liberals had all the brilliant ideas, but the conservatives still had all the guns.
Which was even more true down in the Austrian Empire. I mean, 1848 was a disaster for them. You had Hungarians outright declaring independence. You had Czechs demanding autonomy. Students were literally running the streets of Vienna. Metternich himself actually had to flee the country in disguise.
It really looked like the end of the Habsburg dynasty. It should have been. But the Austrians survived by playing a very cynical game. They played the different ethnic groups against each other.
Divide and conquer.
Exactly. They used Croatian troops to fight the Hungarians, for instance, because the Croatians feared Hungarian domination even more than Austrian rule. And when even that wasn't quite enough to stop the Hungarians, they called in the Russians.
Ugh. The gendarme of Europe enters the chat. Nicholas III sends something like 140,000 Russian troops across the border just to crush the Hungarians on Austria's behalf.
The conservative order saving itself. So by the end of 1849, almost all the monarchs are back on their thrones. The revolution is effectively over. The great turning point of modern history, as historians call it, failed to turn.
But the Europe that emerged from the ashes of 1848 was fundamentally different, wasn't it? I mean, the romantic idealism of the early revolutions was just dead.
Absolutely shattered. The concert of Europe was broken because the monarchs didn't really trust each other anymore. And the liberals learned a very cold, hard lesson. Beautiful speeches and well-written constitutions do not work if you don't have military power.
Which really paves the way for the realpolitik of the late 19th century. The idea that nations are unified by blood and iron, not by parliamentary votes.
Precisely. Now we should shift our focus eastward to the one power that seemed totally immune to the chaos of 1848, Russia.
Right, because they crushed the Decembrists, they crushed the Poles, they crushed the Hungarians. They seemed completely invincible.
They did. But that illusion of invincibility shattered pretty dramatically just a few years later in the Crimean War.
The Crimean War was a humiliating wake-up call for Russia. They were fighting literally on their own doorstep in the Black Sea against Britain and France, and they just got trounced.
It was a logistical nightmare for them. They couldn't move their own troops to the front lines because they had virtually no railroads. Their soldiers were using outdated muskets against modern rifles. It proved to everyone that autocracy without industrialization just equals weakness.
Which brings a new Tsar Alexander II to the throne. He looks at this disaster and realizes that if Russia doesn't modernize, it is going to die. So in 1861, he does the unthinkable. He officially emancipates the serfs.
It is the single largest top-down liberation of human beings in history up to that point. Millions of peasants are suddenly no longer the legal property of the nobility.
But as you pointed out in the sources, we really have to look at the fine print of this emancipation, because the fine print is always where they get you.
Yes, they were legally free, but they were not given the land they had worked for generations. They actually had to buy the land from their former masters.
With money they obviously didn't have.
Right, so they had to take on these massive government loans called redemption payments. And these payments were structured to last for 49 years.
49 years. So they basically just traded legal slavery for generational debt peonage.
Effectively, yes. And to make sure the debt was paid, the government trapped the peasants in these village communes called mirs. The mir enforced collective responsibility. If your neighbor couldn't pay his share of the debt, you had to pay it.
That sounds incredibly oppressive. It didn't create this happy, thriving class of independent farmers like Alexander II had probably hoped. It just created a simmering, deeply resentful rural population.
It did. And for his efforts, Alexander II, the Tsar Liberator, ends up getting assassinated.
Blown up in the street by radical terrorists who felt his reforms hadn't gone nearly far enough.
Which, of course, confirmed the absolute worst fears of his son, Alexander III. He takes over and goes right back to the old family tradition of brutal, secret police repression.
But, and this is a crucial pivot for Russia, even as they cracked down politically, they kept desperately trying to industrialize economically.
Right. Enter Sergei Witt, who becomes the crucial finance minister in the 1890s. He understands that to be a great power in the 20th century, you don't need millions of serfs. You need steel, you need coal, and you need rail.
So Witt puts Russia on the gold standard to attract foreign investment. And it works. French and British capital just floods into the country. They build the Trans-Siberian Railroad. They build massive modern factories in St. Petersburg and Moscow. But industrialization always has a profound social cost. You are ripping these disgruntled peasants out of their traditional villages, and you're cramming them into miserable, disease-ridden urban tenements. You are literally manufacturing a proletariat.
And this is where the comparison to Western Europe is vital. In places like Britain or Germany, as the working class grew, they eventually got some safety valves. They could form labor unions, they could strike, they could eventually vote for socialist political parties.
But in Russia, those safety valves were welded shut. Unions were illegal. Strikes were violently suppressed by the army. Political parties were banned.
So when the pressure builds up in that environment, there is no legal way to let off the steam. You just get an explosion, which is exactly what happens in the Revolution of 1905.
And once again, it's triggered by a humiliating military defeat. This time they lose the Russo-Japanese War.
Yes. The 1905 revolution was essentially a dress rehearsal for the main event in 1917.
Hmm.
You have Bloody Sunday, where the Tsar's troops opened fire on completely peaceful protesters bringing a petition to the Winter Palace.
This just shatters the myth of the Tsar as the benevolent father of the people.
Completely. And that triggers a massive nationwide general strike that
Right.
basically paralyzes the entire Russian economy.
The pressure is so immense that Tsar Nicholas II is finally forced to blink. He issues the October Manifesto.
He promises civil liberties, a constitution, and a national parliament called the Duma. For a brief shining moment, it actually looks like Russia is finally going to become a modern constitutional monarchy.
But it was a total bait and switch, wasn't it?
Yeah.
As soon as the war with Japan ended and his loyal troops came back from the front lines, Nicholas just reneged on the whole deal.
He stripped the Duma of any real legislative power. He kept an absolute veto over everything. And he manipulated the voting laws to ensure that only the ultra-wealthy conservative landowners could actually get elected.
So he essentially rebuilt the paper dam. But the water was already flowing over the top at that point.
And the really tragic consequence of that betrayal was the lesson that the radical revolutionaries learned from it. People like Vladimir Lenin watched 1905 and realized you cannot compromise with the Tsar.
You can't reform the system from within.
Right, you just have to burn the entire structure down.
So as we look back at this whole incredible century, from the Congress of Vienna in 1815 right up to the eve of World War I, we see this constant repetitive cycle. The forces of order seem to win every battle. They crushed the revolts in 1830. They crushed the Springtime of Nations in 1848. They even survived 1905.
They won all the battles, but they were undeniably losing the broader war against history. The central tension of the era, the fact that you simply cannot run a modern industrial economy using a feudal absolutist political system, that tension was never actually resolved.
The Concert of Europe was incredibly successful at delaying the inevitable.
Yeah.
I mean, they did buy the monarchs another 100 years of power.
But the terrible cost of that delay was that when the massive change finally did come in 1914 and 1917, it didn't come as a peaceful democratic transition. It came as a global cataclysm that destroyed millions of lives.
It's a really sobering thought about the nature of political stability. Sometimes the harder you try to stop social change, the more violently destructive you make it when it inevitably arrives.
That is absolutely the enduring lesson of the 19th century. If you bolt the safety valve shutter things, you do not stop the steam from building. You just guarantee that the eventual explosion will take the whole house down with it.
I think that's the perfect provocative thought to leave you with today. We'll wrap up our tour of the 19th century here. There's obviously so much more to unpack in the fallout of these events, but we will save that for another deep dive.
Looking forward to it.
Thanks for listening. And as you look at politics today, keep thinking about those paper dams. We'll see you next time.